Perfect. Hello. Hi. Just maybe wait for a few more participants to get on. Okay, well, anyway. Hello and welcome to the second event of the Michaelmas term for the IFQE, the Oxford Forum for Questioning Extremism, Investigative Journalism in the Age of Spyware. Our discussion today can be broken down into three main parts. First, we'll discuss the revelations made by the recent and ongoing Pegasus Project, with which our panelists are all involved in one way or another. For those in our audience who may be less familiar with this topic, in 2020, it was revealed that a number of people, including at least 180 journalists, were selected for surveillance by governments using Pegasus Spyware, a spyware which has been developed by the Israeli technological company NSO Group. A list of over 50,000 phone numbers was leaked to Forbidden Stories and Amnesty International, who helped to set up the resulting Pegasus Project, an initiative involving over 80 journalists at 17 different papers, which is sought to investigate the extent of this surveillance. We'll then discuss how spyware like Pegasus has endangered and compromised the practice of journalism, as well as how the Pegasus Project has helped us to combat and prevent such espionage. We also want to discuss how real journalists affected by surveillance are endangered and restricted and what we can do to protect them. Then we will discuss what this recent boom in cyber surveillance implies for international relations on a global scale. We'll be in discussion for around 50 minutes, leaving about 10 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. It's now my pleasure to introduce our phenomenal panel of experts. Stephanie Kirchgaessner has been the Guardian's US investigations correspondent since 2018, before which she reported in Rome. She spent 11 years at the Financial Times, including 9 years as their Washington correspondent. For a story about the allegations that Jeff Bezos' phone was hacked by the Saudi government, she was awarded the Technology Prize at the 2020 British Journalism Awards. She has recently been reporting extensively on news relating to the Pegasus Project. We also have Bradley Hope, who is a Pulitzer finalist and a Gerald Loeb Award winner. He has received the Trace International Award for Investigative Reporting and the New York Press Club Award for Business Reporting. He's also the co-founder of the Project Brazen, and as an author has written several books, including Blood and Oil, about the rise to power of Mohammed bin Salman. He's written for numerous papers, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Sun, and the national newspaper in Abu Dhabi. It was recently revealed that in 2018, Mr. Hope was himself selected for surveillance using Pegasus spyware. Laurent Richard is a documentary filmmaker and a journalist. Mr. Richard founded Forbidden Stories in Paris in 2017, a network of investigative journalists devoted to keeping stories alive, working in collaboration with news organizations like Le Monde, the New York Times, and The Guardian. He was named European Journalist of the Year 2018 by the Prix Europa. Forbidden Stories has been, as we will come on to discuss, critical in the success of the Pegasus Project. We are, of course, very, very lucky to have all these esteemed journalists with us today. So thank you all so much for coming on. Now, I'd like to begin by offering each panelist just a few moments to explain their work in more detail and how it intersects with the Pegasus Project. So Stephanie, could we begin with you?
Sure, thanks for having me today. My work on NSO Group started in about 2019 and really developed out of my focus on human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia specifically. And I was also involved in, reporting on looking at NSO's ownership structure, which was pretty complex. And I just became really interested in this threat of surveillance and spyware, and thought it was really not being covered as closely as it ought to be, given the nature of the threat, which is basically that foreign governments could have access to all contents of a mobile phone and could even turn this phone into listening device, for example. And it seemed, like I said, really to be underreported. I was also really interested when WhatsApp came out saying that they had acknowledged that 1,400 of its users had been targeted and in some cases hacked through through Pegasus attack that was, through NSO's customers, and did a lot of reporting around some of those victims. So yeah, and I think as a result of that, I'd worked with Forbidden Stories on another big project. And I think as a result of some of my previous work on NSO, I became involved in this project and was lucky to be the Guardian's lead investigator on this project and work closely with them. Ooh, I'm afraid you're on mute, so I can't hear you.
Sorry. Laurent, could we come to you, please?
Yes, sure. So as you say, the Pegasus Project is a collaborative effort with involving 80 reporters, more than 60 news organizations. We were partnering as well with Amnesty International Security Lab, who was the technical partner during that project, because we were able also not only to see some number on the list, but also to find some evidences on some devices. And so the Pegasus Project is about cyber attacks against, not only against journalists, but against human rights defenders, against head of states or diplomats, or many kind of categories. Most of the categories have in common to represent kind of danger to some powers. And we're talking about some kind of countries that have a very bad reputation in terms of human rights violations, such as Azerbaijan, Morocco, or Mexico. And so it's, I've been interested into threats against press freedom, or I was, before starting Forbidden Stories, I was doing a lot of documentaries, investigative documentaries in some of countries where press freedom were not existing. And I was, for instance, investigating in Azerbaijan high level of corruption within the government of Azerbaijan and involving European companies. And for that kind of stories, journalists in Azerbaijan were really targeted, not only targeted, they were arrested, they were jailed, like Khadija Ismailova, for instance. And so that kind of cyber attack, that way to export as well the terror outside the borders, that way to track journalists, to know who is the source they are talking with, to try to kill the stories, or to do worse, was one of the focus of this investigation.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And Bradley, finally, could we come to you, please?
Thank you. Yeah, I think my experience in this kind of space is more from, the side of covering, kind of like with Laurent, covering the countries that would be the customers of these software. So I've written a lot about Malaysia, during the middle of their big corruption scandal, and they also would lean on different kinds of technology solutions to kind of keep that covered up. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and so I guess my experience has been a little bit less direct with covering the actual technology or the use of it, but I've sort of just been aware of how these countries were using it, and then, as you mentioned, my number was on the list, I guess. So I was potentially a target as well of the United Arab Emirates at some point.
Thank you very much. So Laurent, you spoke a little bit just now about how the Pegasus Project came about, what it's about, and the methods of surveillance it's uncovered. So I think I'll start with perhaps a different angle, and I'll start with Stephanie. How alarmed should journalists be by the relative lack of safeguarding against surveillance and the ease with which governments can spy on journalists?
We should be very alarmed. I'm not sure if every journalist needs to be alarmed. It depends on what, it depends on the kind of work that you do. And every journalist will have a sense of how vulnerable she might be to this kind of surveillance. But I think anyone who is writing, especially critically, about some of the countries that we know are clients, it's you definitely need to think of taking steps to protect your communication and to protect your sources. But ultimately, there's not that much that can be done in a world, especially still dealing in the pandemic, where you are reliant on your on your mobile phone, because encrypted, what we, for those who might not know that much about this kind of spyware, using encrypted apps like Signal or WhatsApp is not necessarily going to protect you, from this kind of hacking attack, whether it's from NSO or any other company like it.
Sure, thank you very much. Bradley, you've spoken about how we possibly only know about the surveillance in, for instance, the Gulf states, as they buy their methods of intelligence from abroad, opening them up to the risk of exposure. In your words, China is much better at keeping a tight lid on what's going on in China as they manufacture their intelligence themselves. So in terms of governmental surveillance worldwide, how much do you think we don't know?
Well, I mean, and also we forget as well that if you're a foreign journalist or a foreign national, the US government would be one of the greatest threats of all to your secrets. So there's no law preventing the US government from surveilling a foreign journalist or accessing their phone and things like that too. So it's not just other countries, but I think in a way, a lot of countries have the countries with the most powerful tools are obviously the biggest countries, but the ones that we can worry about the most are the countries in between who can essentially buy this sort of software and use it for whatever purposes without the sort of checks and balances you would hope would exist in some of the other countries. So, if you can imagine, there's actually not that many countries in the world with true intelligence agencies or true technology kind of intrusion capabilities. So they all go to these private companies to buy those powerful tools, and those private companies can sell them because they're selling them to a government. So you couldn't sell that such a powerful tool to a private individual. And so that's why I think in a way we see a lot of the abuses from countries in the Gulf, from some countries in South America and other places, because they're able to buy this, get access to this tool that's not very widely available, and then they can use it kind of with abandon. There's no one's really keeping them accountable. And perhaps Stephanie could talk more about that too, is from the coverage I read, is that essentially NSO promises they have some sort of internal review process, but it doesn't really feel to me like it's happening in real time by any means. And even when it happens after the fact, there's no transparency into what happened. So it's a pretty unique position that they're in, because they obviously have interest in looking at political figures that are rivals and journalists, and it's I guess the truth is they can't restrain themselves from using it for those kind of more nefarious purposes.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that the one of the big issues with this spyware, just on the back of that, is even if the intention is, because of course the supposed purpose of this is to go after criminals or potential criminals, terrorists, pedophiles. That's the line we keep hearing from the company. What a lot of experts will say who study this is, it's just, if you're an autocratic government, it's just too powerful of a tool to let it go. And in fact, it's not just used against journalists and human rights activists. It's also used government against government. And also it's been used in cases of domestic espionage of people using it against their political enemies, or we suspect at least that's happened. And as for the regulation or lack of regulation, it's sort of, one thing, and I don't know if Laurent could speak to this as well, I was really proud that I think that one of the things we accomplished with this project was that it was the first time that there was a really serious look at Israel's role in this as the kind of regulator of the technology, because of course, before NSO sells this spyware to other countries, it does go through a process not only in NSO, but also in Israel. And what we began to look into, for example, some of the diplomatic relationships that were developed around the sale of NSO, and we did see some impact there. In fact, just recently, there was a meeting between some officials, an official from Israel going over to Paris following some allegations of possible espionage or in fact some hacking of French senior officials. So it's not just about NSO, but also about all these relationships with Israel as well.
Yeah, and just to add something, the issue with that we are facing now is it's not only the question of the software itself, it's really the question of, as we say, of the regulation and the use of the software and who within the country will check that. And what we see with that project and with this investigation is how the privatization and private company can interact with some countries, of course, with Israel behind, and they need an agreement, a green light from the Ministry of Defense to be able to sign some contract with some countries. But when the French, I think, were a little bit embarrassed to discover that officially US people with +1 number in the US territory were not supposed to be targeted. And then they discovered that for the French, it was okay to be targeted. So that's why we have seen we have heard about some meetings in Paris between officials from NSO and officials from the Élysée. But the question now, as Stephanie says, is what to do with that, how leaders, elected people, governments think what they can do after that. And at the European level, at the Council of Europe, at the United Nations level, there is a beginning of talk. Some MEPs want to investigate much more, but what they can do. So some of them are talking about a moratorium. Some of them want to suspend any kind of contract license. But there is a kind of huge embarrassing within the EU, at least, because so we know that there are some countries who are using maybe Pegasus, but in a very strict way, with maybe some judges who are agreeing to be part of the process. But so there is a lack of regulation. There is no regulation actually to protect the citizens. When the bad news of that when you are citizens and if you discover that you have been targeted, there is nothing much you can do after that, even with your lawyers. You can try to sue NSO or your government who is denying, or the company that it was selling your iPhone, but it might be difficult.
You mentioned meetings at the Élysée. I wanted to ask how effective you thought the Pegasus Project has really been. We've heard, for instance, France 24 and Jean Castex talking about legal action that must be taken. We've heard the EU intend to tighten privacy laws, but has any real action actually been taken, and can it really be taken?
At least for France, no. It's even quite a problem. There are two kind of problems. First, as a journalist, we don't have really answers. We have some informal meetings, but we don't have official reaction to that, except the spokesperson of the government within the next few days after the publication was saying, yes, it's embarrassing. If the allegation is serious, that's going to be a problem. We know that French secret services were able to find themselves some traces as well on some 5 ministers who were part of the governments, but there is no action from the parliament as well. So the parliament is very weak in that story. There is no inquiry commission. Even at the executive level, at the Élysée, there is nothing except some informal talks between some countries, between France and Morocco, France and Israel, and maybe France with other European countries. But so far, that's where we are. I think as well that they were a little bit, I think we were able to tell them that they were targeted as well. So they learned that from journalists. And we were also a bit surprised that how much they were unprepared to that kind of attack from NSO. So they say, yeah, but there are the Chinese, the Russian, and NSO Pegasus is just a tiny part of the cyber attack window we have in front of us.
I think there's some areas we might still see some action. I mean, from the US perspective, there were not these kind of confirmed attacks, although there are plenty of Americans who live abroad who have been targeted. But I've previously reported for The Guardian before the Pegasus Project that, that we believe that the FBI has its eye on this, especially following the WhatsApp attacks. So that's sort of one to keep an eye out on. The other thing, again, having to do with WhatsApp, is the ongoing court case in California. So that's not directly related to the project, but what's interesting there is we're gonna see an appeals court decision coming soon, which will show whether NSO can claim a defense of having sovereign immunity from allegations that it, that it targeted WhatsApp users. So if WhatsApp wins kind of that round in court, we're going to see a lot more discovery in that case, which could be very interesting. As for the Pegasus Project and the impact it had, I think what's really important is that I think a lot of people just became aware of this issue. I think journalists became much more aware of it. And what I suspect is, I'm not sure if every government cares about the safety of journalists as their first priority, to be frank. But I think that it has exposed a big national security concern. I think it's a national security concern, at least from the US perspective, to have a bunch of French ministers being targeted with spyware. Again, that's just the US perspective, or any kind of European concern about the kinds of threats this exposes people to, whether it's just the threat of having private information leaked, the threat of blackmail, or any number of issues of that nature, which I think would be a high level concern, but not necessarily aired publicly.
Wonderful. But thinking practically about what the implications of surveillance actually are for journalists like you, Bradley, you've described what's happening now as the kind of arms race for intrusion and said there's really no stopping it. How can journalists protect themselves?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. And actually, just echoing what Stephanie said before, obviously, not every journalist needs to be practicing the same kind of techniques for every story, or for, this is really a problem for, I would say, a few different categories, like anything to do with these autocratic governments, of course, but also anything to do with very high profile disputes between people, between business people, even people, and that kind of extends gradually into the oligarch sector. People that are very well financed can also find ways to piggyback on, even in some cases, governments that have access to this kind of software. I heard a story, I won't say the actual case, but I heard a story about a kind of criminal business person who was able to, he helped finance the purchase of this kind of software for a country and then used it for his own purposes. And so the country got the software and then he got to use it. He got to piggyback on their status as a country. So it's not just, government stories, but I think there's a few things, there's a lot of simple things that you have to do. And it really just goes to leaving your technology behind. It's actually really painful for journalists. We'd rather just be on Signal all the time and be kind of very open and discoverable. But the truth is, if you start a big investigation, like if I was starting right now the 1MDB investigation with everything that I know, I would be a lot more circumspect about using the same phone for so many communications. I would be thinking about, if I discovered somebody in some way, I would try to create some kind of a person-to-person communication system that doesn't rely on us using our actual everyday phones. Even then, it's not perfect because it is still discoverable, but it would just be, it's about taking additional steps that are really annoying and also just not getting lazy, not getting sort of complacent. Those are the sort of basic things you can do. And then just in this theme of sort of reducing your technology is, leave your phone behind. It sounds crazy in this day and age, but if you're going to go meet someone and it's a sensitive meeting, you should leave your phone behind. And because your entire route could become, even if you turn your phone off or whatever you might do, it's still, you're giving a lot of evidence about where you're headed and somebody else is headed. You might be, overheard. And just one other last thing is, as much as the NSO has obviously become the sort of the bastion of this sector, many countries are doing this in-house as well. So take the UAE, for example, they were hiring US former NSA, other kind of government level computer white hat hackers to work in the UAE to essentially do this kind of thing in-house. And so they would go out to the open market and buy from actually reputable companies these zero-day exploits and use them to access people's phones and computers. So NSO is a great example, and they're obviously on a huge scale, but there's also this kind of technology is being wielded in many different ways.
Mm. Well, I suppose that raises a practical issue of changing your phone frequently. I know you said at the Wall Street Journal they provided you with different phones. And I suppose I wanted to ask, since working more as a independent journalist founding the Project Brazen, has your perspective on the vulnerability of journalists changed?
Well, I suppose I don't have a kind of institution that sort of somewhat protects me, but the truth is no newspaper really has a clue about this kind of risk. It's very uncommon that a newspaper will be telling you what to do to protect yourself. If you raise concerns about your security, they might help you, but like me changing my phone wasn't necessarily like an edict from above. I was telling them, we got to change my phone. Like this phone, I don't feel comfortable with this phone anymore. So I think newspapers have a long way to go to understand these risks and try to find ways to mitigate them, although it's going to be very hard. You almost need to have a kind of very complex strategy and plan for every investigative project that veers into this area we talked about. As an individual, though, I just have to kind of, make it up as I go along. But in a way, I actually have a little bit more freedom because I don't have to go through the bureaucracy of the system, and I can also consult with people more readily that are experts, but they're not within the organization. So in a way, I actually find it I feel a little bit more secure in some ways.
Stephanie, Laurent, do you corroborate with those sentiments?
Well, I definitely agree, said it in a slightly different way, that one has to be one's own best advocate and be very knowledgeable of where the risks might be. I'm personally writing about surveillance, but doing it from the United States and doing it with a +1 number, there is this, suggestion that US based people using, not US based, but because of the +1 number, the US number, that those are not attacked. I'm not convinced of that just yet. And of course, anytime anyone goes out of the country, they're at risk. So I do think that people have to be the advocates for themselves. The newsroom doesn't necessarily have all of the best information about how to protect journalists. I would say at The Guardian, though, specifically, I think we are pretty advanced and kind of forward thinking on this, but there's also lots of experience of working on sort of secretive projects at The Guardian as well. So they're not amateurs in this.
And just to add, so something regarding the risk and how to assess the risk and take some decision to limit that. Of course, so the first thing is we have to assume and to understand that nothing is 100% safe. And once you know that, and once you're sure that at some point something that you are texting to someone might fall into the hands of people who are surveilling you or surveilling your source you're talking to, we should always keep that in mind. But I think that one thing that could be useful for protecting us or our stories or the work we are doing is collaboration, of course. And when we are working together on such a project, it's much more difficult to stop one journalist if you know that you have 79 other journalists who are doing the same story. So collaboration is clearly bringing some protection. I think as it was said before, I think having some specific devices ideally for specific investigation is very helpful as well. By doing that, you can limit the damages if you are being hacked as well. And yes, I think it's we have to leave the phone outside as much as we can. That's very important. That's so very difficult to do, but that's something we should do much more.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say one more thing is, in a way, the risk that I would most worry about is about traveling. So like sitting in the UK, sitting in the US, there's a level of risk. But when it comes to going to certain countries, like, so if I were to go, well, I won't say the country, but if I were to go to these high-risk countries, I would consider any device that I brought with me to be completely compromised, you know, because once you're inside that country, they have a different level of access to the phone just through the local carriers. So they can really just open your phone up instantly. One time I spoke to somebody who went to China, and they had a phone that they had designed where it really just displays all of the permissions that were sought as soon as they arrived in the country. And it was just streaming everything, contacts, photos, you know, it was an instant sort of process that they were gaining access to his phone. And so that's a risk that really is to me absolutely clear, that if you're like, so when I go to one of those countries, I bring a new phone, I create a new email address. I don't have any passwords with me. I don't have any contacts. I just keep the contacts I need for that trip. And I create a special email that's like Bradley traveling, so that people can contact me if they need to get to me, but I don't have access to my inbox. And I think that's really a pretty critical thing. And there's many countries in the world where you could be instantly compromised just by setting foot in that country and bringing your phone with you, even if it's off, you know, it's too high of a risk.
And just on that point, I think the person, so we can be the target ourselves because they want to know the story we are writing on or when we will be able to publish that. But the people who can be also targeted is our sources. And I think it's really our duty to make sure to have the safest communication channels with our sources. And most of the time, when you have a whistleblower identify or a source identify, it's always coming with a first contact, with the way you first receive an email, and then your email will be hacked by somebody, and we have seen that before. So the question of the first contact between a source and a journalist is very crucial, and to do that in the best way, there are some tools like FIGRA Europa that are that is a whistleblower submission system that is quite helpful as well, and many news organizations are using that as well. So the question of protecting the sources with our own communication channels and devices is very crucial.
If we could just move on to what the Pegasus Project implies for wider questions of human rights and freedom of speech. The NSO group has violated both the UN's and its own human rights policy. So Laurent, how important is it that they're held accountable?
Talking about accountability is so first you have to understand the official speech of NSO. So NSO is officially selling the software as a private company to state actors, and only to state actors, as they say, for being used in a very official way against terrorists, criminals, pedophiles, and when NSO is explaining how they succeed with that software because they were the number one, or they are still the number one in that cyber industry space, they can use the example of El Chapo arrest to show you the kind of people who can be targeted or could be arrested with that kind of tool. But what we see with the investigation with the Pegasus Project of the partners, we see that the victims are not El Chapo style. It's much more dissidents and human rights defenders and journalists and people we were talking before. So the question of the internal regulation first, how NSO can check the targets of the state actors, of their own customers, is very tricky. It's very difficult because officially NSO say we will never know about your targets. We don't know who you are targeting. We don't know who you are spying on. But they say in the meantime, and that's a bit conflicting with that, they say if we learn by journalists, NGO, that there is some kind of abuses somewhere, we can ask the permission to our own customers to check into the logs to see if the person was targeted. But we have seen that we have many times reporting or writing, or Stephanie have done that before for years, profiling some people who were not terrorists, who were not criminals, who were not El Chapo, were targeted by NSO according Citizen Lab investigation or Amnesty International Security Lab investigation. And then that information was reported to NSO headquarters, and they did clearly nothing about that, or they even did not communicate on that. So the question is about how to be a private company, pretending to do something if something happened, having a board of ethics, having a human rights policy, having a whistleblower policy, but but in the meantime, never communicating about the outcome of your own investigation. And so we were suffering a lack of transparency from NSO side on that aspect.
Sure, and if, as you say, many of the names on the list that was leaked to you have no connection to criminality, then that implies that many of the clients of NSO were breaching their contract. So when the NSO then asserts that actually the ultimate responsibility is on the one who commits the abuse and not NSO, is there anything in that claim, or is this just an industry that shouldn't exist?
NSO say and like to compare the industry to the industry of the weapons. They say if the person who is shooting is not the person who is building the weapon, designing the weapon, or selling the weapon to the person. So that's the way they say. But it's the question is, can we sell some weapons without regulation, without control, and how to prevent that, and what will be the mechanism of that, and who will check exactly what is exactly the human rights policy. We heard at some point that before choosing some partners, NSO was presenting the list of potential customers to a kind of board of people with green light if the country is matching with the human rights policy of the company. But we don't know much more about that. There is really no transparency. I don't know if Stephanie, maybe you can add something about that.
Yeah, I mean, the question of accountability is also difficult because there's so much that, there's so many contradictions, as Laurent pointed out, of how they operate. I mean, for example, if there is like a help desk, there was like a tech desk at NSO. So if it's like, hey, I'm having trouble targeting this victim. Okay, let's help you. I mean, that does happen. So how can you then suggest you have no idea, who the targets are, for example? I think that whole policy is really very murky. The other issue was that we see in a very specific case, very central to the UK, that we reported as part of the project that, Dubai, for example, was a known abuser of NSO. That had been reported in the sense that they went after prominent human rights activists. But we have some, what we've reported based on sourcing our sources is that in 2019, when Dubai wanted access to UK phone numbers, they got that permission from NSO and presumably from Israel as well. So where does the accountability lie there when you are allowing a country to go ahead and access, meaning go ahead and target UK phone numbers? For what purpose? Was it because somebody's ex-wife was living in London, for example? Looks like that might have been one reason. So I think, though, there's another aspect that we focused on in the project, which was a step removed from NSO, which is the technology companies, the mobile, the Apple, the handset makers. It might be hard to get accountability from NSO, but I think suddenly there was a lot more talk about Apple, for example, and how far they were going in protecting users. So I think that's another kind of important outgrowth of the project, was that issue is getting a lot more attention now, and Apple's kind of defended itself. But I think a few weeks after or maybe 2 months or so after we published, one of the groups, Citizen Lab, that works on this a lot, actually discovered the kind of code of the exploit that NSO was using. It's the same code that we had written about that had targeted people as late as 2021, and they kind of shut that down. So sorry for a bit of a rambling answer there, but there's accountability on many levels, whether it's NSO, whether it's Israel, whether it's the countries where people are being attacked, not doing enough to kind of counteract it is another issue, and the technology companies, like I said.
But many of the governments that are using this technology are equally evasive, like the Hungarians, who reinforce that they are a democratic state who kind of use this surveillance with heavily monitored kind of jurisdictions. But how dangerous is it when governments don't take responsibility for the misuse of surveillance technology?
Well, just to add one thing, because I didn't mean to not focus on the countries that are using the technology. I'll tell you, I think one of the issues is, and for example, in Europe, is I think that there are a lot of European countries that are using Pegasus, and maybe they're using it in ways that can be legally justified. Maybe, we really don't know. I wrote about a case of some people in Spain where I think it's quite questionable whether that was legitimate targeting of politicians. We think by the Spanish government or Spanish intelligence agents. But I think it makes it kind of difficult, because if some of these European countries are using the technology for their own reasons, and maybe they are for terrorism related investigations, it really begs the question of whether they're, like Germany, for example, whether they're going to be willing to criticize this company, because they obviously feel the need to use the technology themselves.
Thank you. Could we move to the implications of surveillance for international relations? And Bradley, what role is surveillance playing in soft power struggles in places like the Gulf? You've talked about kind of cyber war unlike any seen in recent history in your book, Blood and Oil. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that now.
Well, I think it's mostly just giving people the capabilities of that they'd never previously had before, to have these kind of cold wars, waged over technology. So, we saw with the kind of battle between the UAE, Saudi Arabia coalition against Qatar, just relentless sort of hacking on both sides, of course, all deniable by the host countries, but the results are clear, leaks about each other, all over the internet and stuff. So I think it just kind of gives, I think the foreign policy concern that I would see is it gives these countries the ability to fight in a way that they never had fought before. And also to potentially undermine other processes around the world, democratic processes, because while they don't have any kind of developed intelligence agencies, most of these countries, they could actually carry out a real operation in another country or against another country. They can, without too much trouble, hire hackers, on the dark web, or use this kind of software, and then the information that they glean from that could be very powerfully used to embarrass someone. We saw in some of these cases, like quite politically connected people in America were hacked. There were sort of, to some extent, positive things that came out of it, like certain nefarious arrangements were revealed to the public because of that hacking. But it does raise a lot of concern about, that may be a kind of accidental benefit or externality in this case. But most of the time, having political figures hacked by other countries, sort of fledgling intelligence operations, it could be pretty dangerous.
Thank you. Laurent, NSO has sold its spyware to authoritarian governments and states with limited freedoms. So could we draw parallels maybe between Israel's decade-long history of selling arms to dictatorships to boost foreign relations and what's happening with NSO now? Or is that a stretch? I'm afraid you're on mute.
Sorry for that, I was muted. Now we see that there is clearly a parallel between the contract and who is contracting with NSO and the relationship between Israel and other countries. So that's a trend that is interesting to understand the geopolitics of that industry and how it's doing. I think that what we discover as well that I think it's, for sure, it's not new at all that governments can spy on other ones. For history, it has been the same thing. I think what NSO is offering to governments is the scale and the numbers of targets they can have at the same time. When we look at what is happening between Morocco and France, it's a good example of two countries who are working together on many important things, including the fight against terrorism. And we have seen a lot of people targeted by Morocco, and they were living on the French territory. A lot of them were Moroccan dissidents living in France who decide to flee the country to escape that kind of treatment. And some of them were much more political figures, including members of the government. So it's interesting to see how a tool can help a government to massively target, to investigate, or surveil, or have some interest to a lot of persons in the same time. Talking about the impact of the Pegasus Project as well, and there is another country where a lot of things is going on. It's India, where the Supreme Court is about to set up an independent committee who will investigate, at least this is what we hope, the misuse of the Pegasus software by the authorities against some opponents and political figures. So yeah.
I suppose that reminds me of a report that Stephanie, you made about Musa Mohammed, a Bahraini activist who fled to London, who criticised the UK government for staying silent on the issue of his having been surveilled. Do you think democratic governments like ours do enough to tackle surveillance?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think the two good examples are the UK and Canada that I can think of. The UK, there are actually countless examples of dissidents who have been targeted. And I wrote about one of them who was sadly really prominent in the data. And we later learned that she'd actually had her phone tested. This is Alal Sadiq, who's an Emirati activist who'd already kind of been driven out of her home, driven out of Qatar, who she'd lived there for a while, and was then living in the UK. Her father is a jailed activist, and it's really tragic. She died actually in a car accident that is not thought to have been kind of suspicious. But I think her example is one where you see, she was really, I think, felt pretty hounded by, sorry, my phone ring. I'm actually going to put myself on mute while this finishes because it's going on. Sorry about that. It's kind of annoying. But I was going to say the story of Alal Sadiq is just so tragic. And really, we haven't seen a big response from the UK. Similarly, in Canada, when Omar Abdulaziz was targeted, and he was, of course, a very good friend and associate of Jamal Khashoggi. And that came out right, days after Khashoggi was killed, or actually, sorry, right before it became known. We just did not see a really big response from Canada. And that's something that Ron Diebert at Citizen Lab talks a lot about. And I think, yeah, like I said, with the UK, and there's many examples. And if anything, we see, close relations between like the UAE and the UK, the Saudis. It doesn't seem to have affected the relationship at all. So that's quite worrying, I think, because there really is an attack on a country's sovereignty to be attacking residents and citizens on the phone networks.
Sure, thank you very much. Bradley, Blood and Oil discusses Mohammed bin Salman's realization of the kind of power of Twitter and how he accrued a Twitter army to pump out his positive propaganda. And I just wondered, did you think the rise in surveillance like Pegasus is almost just a manifestation of the increasing importance of the internet in politics?
Well, I think maybe in Saudi Arabia, it's almost uniquely important because it's such a, social media has been such a major part of Saudi youth culture and just actually society in general, because obviously in the you know, it has been a very restrictive society traditionally. People were not able to mix men and women as much as you would find in other countries just around the corner from Saudi Arabia. So people live on social media a lot more, and so I think what's said on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook means a lot to MBS, because he's also kind of a child of that technology. And so I think in that case, it was especially sensitive, and they really wanted to find out, you know, who is the person, this guy Mujtahid, who is leaking this quite interesting stuff going on inside the royal palace. But yeah, in general, the importance of this kind of technology obviously comes alongside how much everything we do is digital, and so all of the great secrets that maybe once were more kept inside people's heads, or there's trails to be found everywhere. You know, it's the most powerful intelligence gathering tool you could have in this day and age is a cyber intrusion, because you don't have to persuade you know, some sort of intelligence source to speak and things like that. So I think it's, yeah, well, those are my two thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. There's so many more things I'd love to ask, but I think it's only democratic if I open the panel up to questions now. So if anyone in the audience has a question, if you raise your hand, I can allow you to talk.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, cool. I don't think I have my name on the Zoom, but I'm Eliza, and I've really enjoyed listening to everything that all of you guys have to say. I just had one question. So Stephanie, you mentioned how the companies even have protocol for their agents who are stuck and who need to know who they're supposed to be targeting. That seems pretty nefarious, but do you think there's any reasonable justification for the privatization of surveillance and having these sorts of companies which are able to guide people in this way?
I think that's a really good question, Eliza. I mean, I think that I think NSO knows that they do have an argument when they say, how do you prevent, you know, if you could prevent a terrorist attack by being able to kind of look at encrypted messages, you know, and if you could stop a terrorist attack and just by using this technology, you know, they make a point. And I think there are legitimate law enforcement and legal issues that one could discuss and examine. I think what we are focused on in this project and just in our journalism is the fact that there have been so many cases of alleged abuse and so many cases of kind of proven abuse. So that's really what we're focused on. I think, and it's up to governments and countries and law enforcement agencies to come up with the rules of the road and how they could legally use a tool like this. I don't think anybody's, you know, saying that there's absolutely no reason it should ever be used. I just think that it needs to be used within reasonable framework, and there needs to be some accountability when it's abused.
Thank you. I'll come to Anya Braithwaite.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Essentially, I was just going to ask, you know, you mentioned how, you know, this happens a lot with autocratic governments, but, you know, in Spain, for example, the pro-Catalan sort of independence government has also cited sort of cases of domestic espionage and the Spanish government's sort of involvement in that. And I just want to ask, so if I can imagine what the implications of surveillance are in countries where, you know, an adherence to human rights or privacy are not even a pretense. But in a country like Spain, how can surveillance technology and sort of the evidence it gathers be mobilized against political opponents? And sort of what are the implications for the democratic process in these sort of supposed sort of liberal democracies?
Laurent, would you like to take this? Bradley?
Yeah, I don't know exactly how to answer the question, this can go back to the question of the use of and the embarrass we feel at the EU level of many governments who are maybe the customers of NSO, but they don't claim that. Or even if they're not officially the customer, maybe they took part in some international judicial investigation with other countries that were using Pegasus for the investigation, and so that's maybe the problem. As Stephanie said, NSO is making one argument when they say that their technology can stop and prevent some crimes, some terrorist activities or other criminal activities, and the interception of communication for years is authorized in France and many democracies. It's just it's supposed to be very controlled. At some point 20 years ago in France, it was not controlled at all, and we have seen a lot of abuses of that. So that's the question of the rules. So I don't know how to answer the question about regarding precisely Spain and how can evidence can be collected against political figures or human rights defenders. But it goes back again to the mechanism and the check and balance and who is controlling what and how the parliament and people representing the elected people representing the people can interact and knows at least one of the shame of the EU now is that we don't know who is buying Pegasus, and at least we should know. At least we should know that who is having a license with this company, and that's going to be it could be a problem not to know, I think.
I'll just add something briefly on that, which is, this is, so I'm mostly a reader of the Pegasus Project, although my name was mentioned briefly as a target, but I think this is where the Pegasus Project and things like that are actually the greatest value, because all these disparate events in different countries, we wouldn't know about them if it wasn't for journalists highlighting them. And in a way, people often wonder, do you feel like journalism you do is impactful? Did it create a law or something? But even just the very act of exposing an abuse of the system, it has a lot of ripple effects. Some of them are not always visible in the form of a law. Some of them, like just as an example in corruption reporting, if you write about someone as having been involved in corruption for the rest of their life, they have to answer questions at banks to explain that story away. And so in a similar effect, I think, hopefully in an abusive situation in somewhere like Spain, people would rise together and say that's inappropriate, and they would create a law to prevent that kind of abuse. So I think in a way this is a good example of where journalism really plays an important role. So kudos to the Project Pegasus team.
Thank you.
I'll weigh in just on this point, because that Spanish story was one of ours at The Guardian before the Pegasus Project. And I really thought, and I've said this maybe in other publications, I really thought before we published that story that it was going to be a game changer. So this is the flip side of what Bradley just said, of when things don't have the impact that you thought. Because I thought, a major democracy in Europe, and someone was spying on a bunch of political opponents of the government. I thought it was going to have a major effect. The problem was in terms of that people in power in Europe weren't necessarily that fond of these victims, and perhaps even thought there was a point to spying on them, because maybe they were not, maybe they were seen as kind of destabilizing forces. Now that's a kind of a political opinion. And my own personal opinion is that once you go down that road, it's very slippery. It's a very slippery slope to target political actors who one is not very fond of. So I think that the allegations that we raised with the French ministers, suddenly you saw people becoming a lot more concerned because those were kind of seen as real victims. So I still have a little bit of a kind of issue with that, but in any case, the allegations about the French ministers have definitely gotten more attention across Europe.
Well, if no one has anything else to say on that point, I think we've got to wrap it up as we're out of time. So I'd like to thank our fantastic panelists for their time in what has been such an insightful discussion tonight. It's been a real pleasure hosting you all tonight. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.